Good evening and welcome to The Square. Tonight is a very interesting discussion and timely as we talk about elections in Africa and beyond. We're going to look at continental elections, the US elections, and events that happened at the Capitol last week, as well as more other aspects with regards to this topic. And joining us, we have with us once again on The Square, I'm happy to welcome him here, Vincent Gassana. Vincent is a media practitioner as well as a current affairs commentator. Vincent, very happy to have you on the show again.
Thank you.
Great. We also have with us, joining us all the way from London, but we're happy to have him in the studio tonight, Phil Clark, who is a professor at the SOAS University of London. Phil, great to have you on the show tonight.
Thanks, Diana.
Great. My name's Dan Mpisi, host of The Square. As always, I'm joined by the resident panelists. And tonight I'm going to welcome Berna Namata, resident panelist of The Square. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Dan.
Also joining us tonight, as always, resident panelist of The Square is Charles Hubbard. Charles, great to have you on the show.
Same here, Dana. How are you?
Good.
Good.
Before we kick off, we usually have midweek highlights, things that have caught the attention of the Square resident panelists, but tonight's conversation is a meaty one. There's lots to discuss, and we're going to try and, do it within the time frame that we're given every Wednesday night. So the first issue that we're going to talk about is looking at continental elections, with no less than 10 presidential elections in 2021 in the African continent, across the continent in Africa, as well as persistent governance problems. We face another trying year. Of course, plans for economic recovery based on the COVID-19 pandemic. Also, it is advisable that these be addressed together with governance issues that preceded the pandemic. So my question to the panelists, and I'll start with you, Vincent, our guest panelist, before I come to our resident panelist, is just generally, we have elections in neighboring countries such as Uganda. Last year, we also had elections around the region. We also had recent elections in the Central African Republic. So just looking at this year, Vincent, and I'll kick off with you, what are your expectations on these continental elections? And in your opinion, how can Africa normalize nonviolent and fair elections? Because we seem to be plagued by this narrative when it comes to election period that is just seen as, it's always preceded by violence, and you always have commentary about, lack of transparency, lack of fairness. So what are your expectations on this moving forward, looking at 2021, Vincent?
Phew, nice and easy question. Expectations, I suppose, really more hope than expectations. There have been some elections that have gone off without incident. I mean, we've had Ghanaian elections have been absolutely fine, and Malawi wasn't bad. But on the whole, you expect what normally happens, which is the incumbent tries, of course, to stay in, and if they win, the opposition will always cry foul. Nobody it seems, ever loses. Sometimes justifiably, in most cases probably not. And your second question is a much more interesting one, really. And I think that looking at the violence or the ructions in elections in Africa, in a lot of ways, we're looking at the symptoms and often ignoring the causes of all of that. And the causes are structural. And we could go on about this all night, really. But structurally, very few African states, with the exception of really about one or two, very few African states have come to terms with the fact that they were never structurally set up to serve themselves, to serve the Africans, to serve the nations as they are. So, to my mind, until that is acknowledged, and then people begin to look at how to change that structure, we are going to continue to get these issues. You might get fixes here and there in some countries, and you might get elections that are more or less peaceful. But even with those, there will be a potential for those issues for as long as that structure remains.
And we'll definitely get back to that. I know we've talked about the issue of violence. Charles, I know we've touched on this a couple of times on the show. But Phil, moving to you, in your capacity as a, as a professor, in your capacity as someone who is also engaged in political discourse and commentary, what are your thoughts on continental elections, as well as this idea? Vincent has talked about structural issues, but how do you think this whole concept of normalizing nonviolent and free and fair elections across the continent can be realized?
I think 2021 is going to be a real test for African elections, particularly for that issue of violence. 3 of the big presidential elections this year are going to be held in South Sudan, in Somalia and in Libya, 3 African states where there is ongoing conflict. It's going to be fascinating, but I think also concerning to see how those 3 states in fact hold those elections in the context of large-scale violence. And one of the big questions is whether elections help these situations of violence, or do they simply stir them up? Elections by nature are incredibly competitive. They're likely to bring together the very same parties that are involved in the violence. Those same parties will be contesting these elections. So that's going to be a real test for those 3 countries in particular. And then, of course, the other issue that the continent is grappling with is how do you hold these elections in the context of COVID-19? How do you hold not only peaceful elections, but also safe elections? How do you get people to go to campaign rallies? How do you get them to the ballot box in the context of a major pandemic and all of the health concerns that come with that? So I think those are 2 of the big tests for many African states in 2021, how to hold these elections effectively in the context of mass conflict, but also how to do it in a context of COVID-19.
Yeah, and I really appreciate your point on marrying the concept of elections as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. These elections normally are characterized by throngs of people day in, day out, queuing to give their ballots and election campaigns and that sort of thing. So it's something worth looking into. I know we're going to look at what's happening in Uganda on Friday. No, actually tomorrow. Sorry, 14th on Thursday is quite big, and it coincides with the topic for today. But before we get to that and get back to you, Phil and Vincent, I'd like to also hear from the resident panelists. And Charles, I'll kick off with you.
I think if you look at elections, I think there are 2 things that you need to consider. One, getting into power, and the second one, staying in power. And getting into power is more difficult than staying in power. Yeah. And in the African context, it can be almost equally difficult, but differently bloody. And that's the biggest problem that we're having today. Phil talks about examples of Uganda and what have you. Vincent talks about the more peaceful ones around Malawi and what have you. But it's very important to put things in context and say, in the wake of COVID-19, because this was never precedented, I, for one, my personal opinion is that one of the most stupid things, and forgive my deep knowledge of Portuguese, is that elections should not have been held during a pandemic. You should not put the people you intend to lead under jeopardy, under health jeopardy, under extreme risk. The biggest price, that a country has had to pay is Burundi, where they actually lost a head of state. Fast forward, Vincent did refer to the peacefulness of Malawi, but they've lost 3 people in their hierarchy, a prime minister and 2 ministers, in a space of 1 month. It's a very, very high price to pay. So I think that's one thing. Even in the United States of America, people are dying in their hundreds of thousands. For crying out loud, President Trump caught COVID. So I think the most stupid thing to do is to hold an election during a pandemic.
So you think all these
Yes.
elections, well, a lot of them that were held last year, and we discussed this several times, well, once on the show last year, the ones that are set for this year should be postponed?
Should have been.
But you see, the crux of that, of the crux of the matter when you talk about that is that we don't know how long COVID is here to stay for. You know, there talks about a vaccine,
No.
there's talk about...
This is...
So when you say postponed until when, and postponed to what duration, for how long, based on the way everyone, and you keep on saying these words, guesswork, you know, when it comes to the pandemic.
No, it's guesswork. But again, as I said, there are two categories, coming in and staying in. There's a lot of pressure when you're in power to stay in power, and there's equally immense pressure when you're in power from those who want to come into power. So the pressure that would have come in from those who are out, who want to come in as far as the speediness of the vaccine and managing the pandemic would have been good enough to ensure that the pandemic is put into control. And at the risk of bragging, I want to give an example of Rwanda. We're not in an election period. But if you look at the efforts with which the government has handled the pandemic, it tells you one thing, that when you want to win a war, you will be very, very deliberate with it. If our neighboring countries are using sticks and guns and everything to stay in an election, imagine if they could only use half of those efforts to beat the pandemic. The elections would be a smooth affair, hypothetically speaking. Then, yeah.
Brenna?
I think if we look at the trend on the continent, we are seeing that there's a legitimacy crisis, and at several levels, but mainly from liberation movements. You know, you have political parties, you have leaders that are associated with the liberation struggle. But what we are seeing is that for most countries on the continent, now there's a transition into a different setting. So what is at hand, and I think why we continue to see a lot of violence, is because clearly there are unfulfilled promises of liberation. So a time comes and the judgment is no longer about what you promised to do, but what you have done. And I think as increasingly, the more we have in most of these countries, people who feel that what was promised was not delivered, then you'll face resistance. And then in the face of resistance, I think that is where we are seeing excessive force. You know, there's... I'm trying to find the right word.
Are you trying to be politically correct?
Not really, just so that I put it rightly. So you have a legitimacy crisis, okay? You failed to deliver on the promises of liberation. And then there's this whole new generation of young people who are saying, we don't care about your liberation. When we look at your track record, there's not so much that gives us confidence about the future that we want for ourselves and for our children. And so we are seeing that increasingly, of course, regimes across the continent are under pressure because of that. You can no longer campaign on the basis of, we liberated you. Yeah.
30 plus years ago.
You know, yes. Yeah. Where are the results?
You had Maram roads and now you're walking on tarmac roads.
Yes. So the judgment is quite harsh. And as a result, you know, we are continuing to see political violence associated with elections because of that. Now, If you ask me, it is quite unfortunate. It's quite unfortunate, but it will not stop. It will not stop because, again, increasingly, the more these liberation movements want to force, especially young people, to comply, the more resistance they will face. I mean, the Ugandan case, we've seen that, for instance, if you look at the Bobi Wine campaign, the young people behind Bobi Wine are very aware of the threats, and what is at stake. But they will brave it and go, because I think from the beginning of the campaign, there was an anticipation that perhaps force would make them disappear, but they didn't disappear. And I think that's a lesson for anybody else, across the continent. We'll continue to see that the time is up for the historical, kind of liberation sentiments, using them around elections.
So an issue of conducting campaigns during a pandemic, Charles, as you said, is just, it is not the best idea. And you, Bernard, your issue is also to do with legitimacy. These are administrations or governments that have failed to deliver on their promises based on, whether it's revolutions or how they came into power, and the youth are basically not buying these promises of tomorrow based on the current these current administrations. Vincent and Phil, would you like to weigh in on that just very quickly before we move to the next topic? And I'll start with you, Vincent.
I mean, I understand this whole idea of holding elections while in the middle of a pandemic, but the first thing that you'd get is in a lot of countries, people would cause an awful lot of trouble. They would see it as a way of trying to extend your time in office, and that would add to the problem of conflict. And it has happened in Ethiopia, for instance, where they did say, well, look, they did it properly. They went through the constitution. The parliament allowed the government an extra term while the while the country fights the pandemic. But it didn't stop a part of the country deciding to hold their own elections. And I'd imagine you get that elsewhere. But let's put the question of COVID-19 aside for the moment, because I think COVID-19 might say, well, look, all this was happening before I arrived, so no point blaming me on all of this. And the Bernard's idea of liberation movements coming under pressure. The case of Uganda, the NRM is having problems simply because the NRM moved away from what it was. It had the NRM followed its principles, I absolutely bet anything that we would not have these issues now, which takes me back to the idea of the structure of the African state. This is the issue here. Charles was giving the example of Rwanda. Let's use a contrasting example and see. Look, the thinkers, the framers of the RPF political philosophy, when they were putting together what the nation, by which one means the people mostly, needed, anyone who is familiar with the RPF will know about the 8-point program that then becomes the 9-point program because of the genocide against the Tutsi. But the 8-point program primarily, once they put all of that together, what it would need to not only restructure the nation, but actually go on and develop and structure the nation, they then decided to wrap it in within the culture and the history of the Rwandan people, of the Rwandan state, so that the people can own it, so that people can understand it. Now, this was pretty genius. And it may not have originated with the IPF. We know that they looked around in various, historically, and they were very much within the perspective of the liberation movement, so they understand all the things that was going on. But it's the first time that we see this actually being implemented. And, you only have to go around Rwanda and ask, even the people who are most unhappy with their situation in life, people who feel they, haven't got much of what they need, they will still feel ownership of what is going on. You know, it is the first time that we're looking at an African state, looking at the structure of the African state, and beginning to change it to fit into what the culture, the history, and the African state itself needs. I mean, we're talking about elsewhere, we're talking about the colonial state here. And I have to repeat this, until such a time that countries understand that unless you change that structure, you can have various fixes here and there. And, you know, making sure that people have got the things that they need, that will get you quite far. But that, I argue, is also a fix that sooner or later will require, you know, a fundamental change. And there's got to need to be a reckoning with the fact that these states were designed for something else other than the people who live in them.
Thank you very much for that point. And I agree with you on your point, Vincent, when you talk about inheriting colonial structures, you know, for these states that are currently being governed by African leaders. Fundamentally, definitely a change needs to happen. I don't know if we're going to see it in our lifetimes, but, you know, these are conversations worth having. Phil, over to you just to weigh in on what we've been talking about before we go to the next topic, which is looking at elections beyond Africa, mostly in the West.
I mean, the one thing that I would add to, I think, all these very important points that the other panelists have made is that we often fixate on presidential elections, but I think there are other important elections happening across the continent this year. We only have to look at what's going on in neighbouring DRC at the moment to see how important our national elections, our parliamentary elections are. You can win the presidency, but if you don't win the Senate or the House of Representatives, you can end up as a lame duck or a hamstrung president. So I think parliamentary elections are something that we need to pay close attention to this year. I would pick one example of Cote d'Ivoire. Ouattara won the presidential election last year, but it seems like his party has a real fight on their hands to win control of the National Assembly in Cote d'Ivoire. If his party doesn't win that, then it's going to completely alter his presidency. But even at the subnational level, I think we're going to see very important elections this year. In South Africa, there are going to be very important municipal elections. The municipal elections in South Africa matter because that's the level where healthcare is delivered. And in the middle of a pandemic, in many respects, the municipal level could end up being as important as the national level. But even here in Rwanda, we're going to see local elections at the end of February, at the district level, at the sector level, at the Umudugudu level. To go to Charles's point, I think Rwanda made a very wise decision to twice postpone those local elections because of the COVID-19 situation. It would have been madness to hold those local elections when they were initially supposed to be held at the end of last year. I think it's important that they go ahead at the end of February. And of course, in the middle of a pandemic, again, in the Rwandan context, it's the district, it's the sector, it's the Umudugudu levels that are going to be delivering and implementing some of the key healthcare policies in the middle of a pandemic. Local people are heavily invested in those local elections. And so, yes, we rightly talk a lot about presidential votes, but I think we also need to be looking at the elections that are happening at other levels of African societies.
Charles, do you want to on that quickly?
Yes. Phil has really tickled my mind around one particular thing, around the strength and the importance of elections. So, elections, obviously the prized cake is the presidential seat. But we do not understand that the entire structure operates around an ecosystem. And it brings me to my Rwandan system. And even though Vincent did not go to the detail of this, I'm at the risk of stealing what he wanted to say. The politics of consensus. Now, the politics of consensus, which may be largely a Rwandan thing, I'm sure they did not reinvent that wheel, but it has worked in other jurisdictions. Is it the best in other jurisdictions? Probably not. Is it the best in our jurisdiction? Maybe not. Does it work for us? Definitely yes. Now, we need to appreciate that the cost on human toll, financial toll, and what have you, of splitting all the resources you have to have a sort of divergent approach towards a goal that is up there. Now, we're all looking at the topic today was presidential elections. Phil has just said there's more to it about elections than presidential elections. I mean, for crying out loud, Trump was clearly seeing that he's losing and he has lost the presidency, and he said, raid Capitol Hill. Vincent has just said it bang on. The 8-point program was predominantly around, I don't know about Diana and Bana, the political party you belong to, but my political party prescribes around the principle of inclusiveness. Now, you may not necessarily agree with us as RPF, but if you do not agree with us, can you bring your divergent opinions and then we move together in the same direction? And that is what sometimes many of our African countries get wrong. And it brings me to my next point around how corrosive African elections get. Look at Uganda today. They have 11 presidential candidates, 8 of whom Diana does not know. So of what use is it? Yeah, so it defeats the purpose. So it just shows you that generally speaking, it is extremely important that at the base, we all agree on what we want at the top. It will make it a lot easier to get it at the top. And of course, America is one of the oldest democracies, is the best example to give. It explains why the Republican primaries or the Democratic primaries are extremely competitive. And then it makes the presidential elections a bit of a walk in the park for whoever is in there. Yeah.
Brenda, do you want to weigh in on that before we go to the next point?
No, I think just to reaffirm the issue of inclusive politics, I think is perhaps every political party should aspire to that, because in absence of inclusive participation, the system is bound to fail at some point. And we've seen so far, I think there are countries that have also done well. For instance, one that is not usually in the news, like Somaliland. You know, if you look at the structure of Somaliland, it is actually power sharing, and it's how they came up with that. You know, they had different clans come up and sit, and the elders, and they decided, you know, how they wanted their country to be governed. So. But I think that we can't always point out, blame the colonialists, because for crying out loud, how many years since independence? And if we can't fix our systems, I think it's just wrong that we keep referring to the colonial system. If you're a political party and you're more than 25 years old and you don't have structures that, can deliver the aspirations of your political party, then I think it is wrong to still point to the colonial systems.
I mean, you inherit them. It does not take more than 2 decades to change the structures, at the very least.
Yeah, and it's well within the political parties to prioritize and make some of these decisions. But of course, having control, again, is a function of many other things. Most of us will remember that multi-party systems actually came from somewhere, and there were conditionalities, imposed on countries. So, and that system hasn't changed for a reason, because up to today we still look up to some of these nations for resources, and if you're going to get their resources, they're going to dictate a few things. So until you build the local capacity, sometimes it's difficult to implement the homegrown solutions as you would think you'd want them to be.
Based on external pressures.
Yes.
that you've just mentioned. Okay, we are now going to go to the second part of this conversation, which is looking at elections beyond Africa. And in this, we are specifically referring to the U.S. presidential elections that took place in November, but really to do with the events that took place last week. The world watched in shock and in horror as this, a country that's considered a bastion of democracy. Trump supporters stormed the Capitol building and, were trying to halt the vote to block, the certification of the presidential election that was held in November. And what we saw was something that people kept on saying, this is not American, this is not part of our democracy, this is not how our structures work. And my question to you all is, what lessons do you think the world learned from seeing this in a country considered, as a model, basically, of democracy, but just looking inward from an African perspective on how, we do not only just elections, but how we also implement most of our governance models. And, Charles, I'll kick off with you on this.
Thank you, Diana. I think, first of all, it was unprecedented that we would think that one of the world's model democracies would come up with such a barbaric, and I'll put barbaric not because of the storming of the Capitol, but because you saw people, and not necessarily the best of choice of words to use on national television, but people easing themselves in parliament to make a point. Spare Diana the more crude way of putting it. But really, the point is that strengths of institutions is what will make governments survive. If the President of the United States of America, the most feared person in the world, would come up and create an insurrection and incite people to raid an institution, and they actually do it, and other organs of the state come up to rebuke him, and institutions of that state come up to rebuke their president, it says so much about what we should learn. Now, it is very easy for any other president to say, if that can happen in the United States of America, why shouldn't it happen in our country? Because we are always the first people to be blamed as Africa to be hooligan in nature. But I think there's a very, very big lesson to me and to us, and this is the biggest lesson that I got, that the strengths of institutions. The United States of America taught the world that the president, the head of state, even though he's the leader, he's not the supreme, he should not be the supreme leader of the nation. And he also can be called to check. Whoever thought that in this day and age, the presidents of the United States of America would have his Twitter account and all his other social media accounts blocked?
An entire president
yes, it actually happened
media.
At the height, in the middle of the last square we had here.
Yes.
By the time we got off here, we could not look at his tweets. Last Wednesday.
Yes.
So this really comes to tell us to preach humility and the importance of the strengths of institutions.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Brenna?
I keep thinking that I don't know whether there's any point in discussing the U.S. Personally, because I feel that Americans, whatever is happening, they will manage and they will be just fine, with whatever they will be happening, whatever is happening. But again, you can't ignore the U.S. for what it does around the world. Of course, it's gotten a beating for being the leading exporter of liberal democracy. And so, as we saw statements from many American politicians, they are concerned not just about what happened at home, but also the message, it sends to the the countries where they've been exporting some of these ideas. But I'm confident that America will be just fine, no matter what, and I'll tell you why. In not many countries in Africa, I don't know if there's any, where we have institutions that are not tied to individuals. We are not yet there. Because today, in spite of everything, the Americans can agree to disagree and fight, and you will still have a few sober heads that will make decisions that will challenge the head of state. I don't think in any African state we still have many. We have institutions that can do that. Yeah. So for me, I feel that we shouldn't worry about the Americans. Let's worry about our own institutions and try to find what works for us. Because Trump is gone, there'll be a new head of state, fine. But then whatever they do is for the American people. And it will remain America first. Whoever takes office, it will be America first. So how about we just focus on what we can do for ourselves? What we need to change. Perhaps it's high time we stopped looking at the U.S. as the godfather who will solve everything. And I'll give you an example, because we tend to see, for instance, most of our civil society largely depends on funding from, the West. Now, of course, Rwanda gets a beating for funding political parties, but maybe it works. So it's a tough one, but I feel that we have our bigger internal issues to look at than worry about what's happening in the U.S. The U.S. will be just fine.
Yeah,
I'm tempted to comment on that.
Yeah, but I also want to say that I think I totally agree with you, Brenna. I think now more than ever we need to look inward. The pandemic has fast-tracked ideas on how we need to be more self-reliant than ever. When it comes to governance, when it comes to elections, I think we need to be self-reliant more than ever. And I think it's not so much about worrying and obsessing and being mesmerized by what's happening in the West, but we're a globalized community, we're all interconnected one way or another. So I think it's more or less looking at what's happening in a country like that, if this can happen there, and understanding how more than ever we need to look inward and fix our own issues. I think the turning point for me, the lesson learned, so to speak, for me was not really continuing to obsess, so what does the US say, what is their foreign policy approach to the continent and so forth and so on. But if that can happen there, we need to really be careful and look at, our youthful populations, our governance models. You talked about legitimacy problems and these uprisings that are coming through. We need to take notes now than ever before, we have different sort of uprisings or springs, sort of call them, continentally speaking. Charles, just very quickly before we go to Phil and Vincent.
Yeah, just very quickly. Not so often do I agree with Bana, but I want to put a twist to what she said on a sort of sarcastically positive note. Now, what Trump did should be a model to African presidents. It should be a lesson. That you can tell people to do something and they do it and it turns against you. Now, how many African countries can it happen to? I'm not so sure how many there are. But, and that's really the point that you're saying. Yes, it's extremely important, and that's why I'm saying I disagree with Bana a little bit on that one. It's extremely important that we draw a leaf from that one, that yes, okay, if Bana Namata is the president of Wakanda in 2032, and she tells people to walk up to Nyamagabe, the capital city of Wakanda, and revolt, and they do it, and they are repelled, and Bana is sentenced to life in prison. What does that mean to other heads of state? Because you're not a supreme leader. And that's really the message that we should be able to learn from the American system.
Phil and Vincent, over to you. I'll kick off with you, Phil. Your thoughts, your commentary on the points we're discussing at the moment.
I think what's happened in the US in the last week is the great unveiling of the sickness of American democracy. I think The US has been an incredible propagandist for this idea that it is the great democracy. It's never been anything of the sort. Right from the moment of the founding fathers, this is a democracy that has been founded on the country's original sin of racial segregation and the subjugation of the African American population. It's a society that has never come to terms with that. Its entire political system is predicated on voter suppression and keeping down the African American vote. It's also a system that has always involved an enormous amount of violence. Think of the great political assassinations of American political life, whether it's Abraham Lincoln or John F. Kennedy or the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan. This has been a racially divisive, violent form of governance for 200 years. And I think we make a mistake if we think that what has happened in the US in the last week is only a symptom of the Donald Trump administration. This is chickens coming home to roost. This has been brewing for 2 centuries. Trump, in many ways, was simply the match that lit the bonfire. And I think the message that sends to the American people is don't think of yourselves as a great democracy. Think of yourselves as a society that is deeply divided and deeply democratically sick, in need of a desperate cure. The message to the rest of the world is if you're looking to America for political guidance, for some inspiration of how to run an effective democracy, you really need to look elsewhere. The great hypocrisy of the US in the last 50 years in particular has been not only its violence at home, but its attempt to violently export democracy to other parts of the world, often involving the violent toppling of democratically elected leaders. Allende in Chile, Lumumba in Congo, even the violent toppling of Saddam or the violent toppling of Gaddafi was all done under the rubric of America's attempt to export its own model of democracy to the rest of the world, doing enormous damage to those societies, but also propagating a lie about the model of democracy that was being practiced at home in America. So this is a real moment of truth. This is a real moment of revelation, not just for the American people, but for the globe.
Thank you, Phil. Vincent?
Well, just before I get to that, because actually Phil's covered quite a lot of what I was going to cover better than I would have done. But let me just go back slightly, very quickly, on what Ben was saying and bang on a little bit more about my idea of structures within the African system, which is that Banda says we can't keep blaming the colonials. And I agree, we shouldn't keep blaming the colonial state, but we should keep blaming ourselves for keeping those structures. So we should keep talking about the colonial structures. We should keep talking about the colonial state. And what, for instance, you look at, there is a relationship between what has happened, what is happening in Rwanda, for instance, and what happens in the United States where we're going, which is both countries will fix the problems, but from their own perspective. Essentially, if you're fixing problems that are structurally not yours, not of yours, not that of a structure that is meant for something else, how on earth do you begin to do that? You know, America, as Banner says, will be absolutely fine, because it is far from perfect. As a lot of the points Phil has made them. The founding fathers, whom they revere so much, most of them were patricians, really, and a lot of the system, the electoral college, is actually there to prevent people from being too democratic about things. And in America, you can win the presidency with the least number of votes, and you can lose it with the most number of votes. So there are lots that they need to fix. And when we look at the healthcare system in America, for instance, this is the richest, and in a lot of ways, it is a great nation, and it's got extraordinary capabilities. And yet, you know, today we learn that in a single day to COVID-19, America has lost the same number of people that Japan and South Korea have lost in the entire year. And that is a country that has got all of these capabilities. So they've got a lot they can fix. But the important bit is, and this is where I keep banging on about these structures, is that it is their system. It was done from their culture, the way they wanted it. And when they get round to wanting to fix it, at the moment it doesn't seem as if they want to fix it. The system that was put in place suits somebody, and those whom it suits have the power to keep it there. But when they get to a stage where they want to fix it, they'll know how to, because it is theirs. It's from within their cultures, from within their history. What we cannot do in most African states is, how do you begin to do something that is grafted onto you that isn't entirely yours?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Incredible. Incredibly put, and that's definitely food for thought. We have a dozen tweets coming in from our viewers that I'd like us to read, and if we have time, we can comment on some of them. And thank you very much for sending in your comments and your thoughts on the topic for today. The first tweet is coming in from Frank Chigenza, who says, the US president was perceived to be the most powerful human on the planet until Twitter and Facebook blocked his accounts. Is social media's software power a wake-up call to politicians feathering their own nest rather than working for the people they're supposed to represent? And I think Charles and Berner, you alluded to this. The second tweet that we have coming in, just very quickly. As
that tweet is being loaded onto, you know, Ugandan politicians are known for coming up with all sorts of titles to themselves. They used to be at one point a conqueror of the British Empire. I think very soon we might have a conqueror of social media.
And the internet. Considering what's happening in Uganda right now, I think they've shut down, the internet, social media, and what have you. We have another tweet coming in from Tuisenje Jackson, and Jackson states that according to me, the problems of election in Africa is that the leaders misinterpret democracy. Where they're in campaigns, they really explain to the citizens what democracy is, but after becoming leaders, they do the opposite. Again, legitimacy, Brennan, what you're talking about earlier on. And then we have another tweet coming in from Muhuzi Dixon, who says that I think Africa shouldn't have to rely on the Westerners' interest or impressions to have our law in getting in order elections. The lady with the locks, mentioning you, Brenner, mentioned Bobby Wine, but he's misleading the African masses, and we shouldn't even use him as an example. I'm not sure why Dixon says that he's entitled to his opinion, of course. We also have another tweet coming in from Jackson before we go to Richard later on, who says that talking about elections, people may think about presidential elections, yet there's also a lack of transparency in local government elections. So please, could you also talk a little bit about the local government elections? Please, all start from there. Definitely, if we have time for that. We also have another tweet.
On its own.
Yes, it's a topic on its own. Absolutely.
Talk about the local government selection.
We have another tweet coming in from Richard Rugojera, who says that the overturning of the result in Malawi's presidential contest for me is the biggest lesson. The presence of strong, resilient institutions, for example, judiciary, and the fact that the military protected rioting opposition surprised me. A sweet lesson to the US from Africa. That's Richard's tweet. We also have another tweet coming in from Fred, we'll read Jackson first. He also says about the elections, what's happening in the USA should teach Africans that the real democracy must be based on citizens of the country rather than copying from other countries. None should put himself on top as a democracy master. And our last tweet before we go to our closing remarks is from Fred, who states that we are talking. As we're talking right now, internet and social media in Uganda has been shut down by government. No access to information, intimidation by the regime. Peaceful transition and transparency of election in Africa is still a long way. Sadly, you cannot hear anything about the African Union on this. I think we have a couple of more tweets, but before we do that, we have a tweet coming in from Dolapo Aina. I know this is coming all the way from Nigeria, and he states that, interesting topics, the Capitol building fiasco was not a surprise to discerning observers of USA politics, especially since 2016. It takes close to 20 years to fix one bad political term. The panelists are right, let's focus more on African-grown political solutions. I want us to just give our closing remarks on the topics that we've been discussing, generally elections continentally as well as what's been happening in the US and the lessons learned. Phil, you put it very well. This is a sort of, we're seeing the underbelly of a country that has had issues with, these things when it comes to governance and democracy. Vincent, you talked about inheriting colonial structures, and if we were to change these structures, yes, we inherited them, but it's time to change, but we need to start being able to revisit these models of governance and make them work for us as Africans. And Charles, you talked about the COVID-19 pandemic and the madness in conducting elections during this period, but I think what has to be done has to be done. And Brenna, very, very succinctly put, you talked about legitimacy. A big portion, more than half of this continent is people, young people, is youth. And it's coming to a point whereby we're challenging our leaders to really walk the talk and deliver on the promises they made. So just very quickly, closing remarks on the topic, as well as commentary on the tweets that have been coming in. And I'll start with you, Vincent, and then Phil, and then over to you, Phil.
Well, a couple of tweets that I want to pick up there. One of them is that democracy should come from within. I picked that one up because it's going on about what I was going on, essentially, which is the issue is not democracy. The issue is whether or not you have your own structures that are based in your own culture and your own history and what you want to do. And somebody was saying the United States is going to be fine. Of course, the United States is going to be fine because that's precisely what they are doing, and what they need to fix, they will fix from within their perspective. So generally, and the issue of delivery also. I mean, honestly, we do need to keep looking at what it is, how the basis of the African state at the moment. If we don't do that, even if the countries do deliver, as I said earlier, there will be disruptions sooner or later, because it's just grafting on systems that are not supposed to be doing, are supposed to be serving another sphere, if you like.
Thank you very much. Phil, we have less than 1 minute. If you could give your closing remarks before we end tonight's show.
I was prompted by the tweet about the role of judiciaries in African elections. And again, I think that's a topic that we don't talk about enough. The Malawian election put a spotlight on the role of the judiciary, but even recently we had the case in Kenya of the court there forcing a rerun of a national election. I think that also shows that the power that courts can have, that even if there is malpractice in the holding of an election, there's a very important role for African courts in putting the brakes on that and enforcing democratic norms. I remember being in Uganda in 2006, a heavily rigged election. Museveni and the NRM undoubtedly won that election through malpractice, bribery, corruption, and you name it. The Supreme Court ruled initially 5-4 that vote had been rigged and tried to award it, in fact, to Besigye and the FDC, the opposition party. And the NRM had to send the Black Mambas into the courtroom to change the judges' minds forcibly. Now, how different Ugandan political history might have been had that court's initial ruling, in fact, been upheld in 2006. The vote tomorrow would undoubtedly look very different if that very courageous court had been permitted to go ahead with the ruling that they were about to hand down. So we've talked a lot about presidencies, we've talked a lot about election campaigns, we've talked about elections at different levels, but I think all of this is a reminder that African courts have a very important role to play in the conduct of these elections as well.
Thank you very much to our guests, Phil Clark. Thank you very much for joining us. And Vincent, once again, I believe this is your second or third time on the square. Always a pleasure to have you when we have this sort of discussions. Charles and Brenna, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I would have loved to hear your closing remarks. Unfortunately, time's not on our side. But I'd like to thank you very much, Charles and Brenna. Once again to you, Phil and Vincent. And so viewers, keep the discussion coming through using #TheSquareRW. I'd like to thank our partners, Uzi Collections and Bourbon Coffee, always for always supporting the Square. And have a good night. See you again next week.